blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity and save our souls, O good one. Amen. So I have Marilyn here in the background. You might be able to see her. Anyway, there she is.
Hi, Marilyn.
So,
Silent witness.
yeah. So I have two sections to the class tonight. I want to talk about the period of in Russian-American church history of where things were pretty much together in ROCOR, 1934 to 1946. Then the schism of 1946 and the fallout from that. But from there, I want to begin discussing ecclesiology, because this is the real thing that puts all of this into context, into theological context, so that you can see the nature of the problems from a canonical perspective, as well as from the perspective of a just an organizational perspective. Let's see. 1934, there had been the two different jurisdictions in America. You had Metropolitan Platon, who had been part of ROCOR, but then he broke with ROCOR, and they were semi-independent and kind of in and out of communion. But ROCOR really, it was very small. There were just a few people, a couple of bishops and a few parishes. However, when we're talking about ROCOR, we're talking about the Synod of Bishops that was in Sremski Karlovci in Serbia. And 1934, Platon died, and Theophilus was elected Metropolitan, and he reconciled with ROCOR. And it was at the instigation and the encouragement of Patriarch Varnava of Serbia that there was the attempt to reconcile both Platon's Metropolia as well as Evlogi's Metropolia of Western Europe. Evlogi, of course, eventually went into the Ecumenical Patriarchate and that group remained there until last year. Whereas Platon died in 34, and Theophilus restored the relationship with the blessing and encouragement of Patriarch Varnava of Serbia. And the Serbs too had made peace among themselves. Of course, this was the era between the two wars, and so there was some relative calm in Europe. And there was a lot of free movement of people, except I think in and out of the Soviet Union. So Theophilus began the relationship. It was blessed by the Bishops' Council in Pittsburgh in 1936. And in 1937, they called an All-American Council, which would become the All-American Council. It was already the sixth, I believe, that became the kind of governing body that was seen within the American Metropolia as the very as the ultimate legal authority within the church. And this is going to be a theme. The All-American Council, and what goes along with it, the Metropolitan Council. During this time, and so at the 1937 council, the restoration of the relationship with ROCOR was validated and validated by the bishops, and both ROCOR and the American Metropolia was reunited as a diocese of ROCOR. About the same time, you had Archbishop Vitaly, who was very active in the establishment of St. Vladimir Seminary and in developing St. Vladimir Seminary as a grad school. And this is also an important development, because St. Vladimir's would play a huge role in the development of the American Metropolia. So basically, during this time, peace was established in the church, and basically church life went on in a very kind of normal way, and parishes were opened, and bishops were elected, and priests were ordained, and they were training the clergy, and they had, they had the new seminaries, and things were going well. Then during World War II, 1943, Stalin thought that they were losing the war. And indeed, Moscow and St. Petersburg were surrounded by the Nazis. St. Petersburg in this horrific siege of Leningrad, in which people were suffering immensely, and for almost 3 years. Stalin had the miraculous icons flown around over the city to encourage the faithful, and he began to let the bishops out of prison, and he had them elect a patriarch. And they elected Metropolitan Sergius, who had been the locum tenens now since about 1927. And he is the one who made that famous declaration of rapprochement with the communists. So that made him an extremely unpopular person with the Russian exiles abroad. However, it did lay the foundation for the living church to fall apart, and for the Orthodox Church in Russia generally to be unified. In order to elect the patriarch, Stalin pulled 18 bishops out of the Gulag, which is where most of the bishops were at the time. I think there were only 4 that had lived in relative freedom. But he also opened thousands of parishes, or allowed the church to open thousands of parishes, monasteries, seminaries. And so to some extent, the church began to go back to normal. Still, people were being taken off to the gulags, and they were very careful about what they said, but there was still a semblance of order within the church. And so because of this, the American bishops decided to recognize Sergius as the legitimate patriarch, but only to commemorate him, not to submit to him administratively. This recognition was contrary to the statute that they had signed in 1936 with ROCOR, because such a decision could only be made by the full council of bishops of ROCOR, not by any individual part of it. Now, in 1945, Sergius died, and Alexis I was elected. The American bishops sent 2 representatives for the enthronement of the patriarch, and to discuss the reunification of the American church with Moscow and to present terms. And certain conditions were laid down by the Patriarchate. That it would be a unit of the Russian Orthodox Church. It would be an autonomous church, and they would elect a new metropolitan. But the two conditions were that they would repudiate all politics, and especially any anti-Soviet politics. And the new metropolitan had to be elected by a 2/3 majority, and it had to be confirmed by Moscow. They also proposed that within this, they would send Metropolitan Alexis of Yaroslavl to oversee the council that would elect the new metropolitan, and to solidify the reunification between this diocese of the Church abroad and the Moscow Patriarchate. Well, this obviously was not. This was not in line with the agreement that the American diocese had made with the bishops' synod in Yugoslavia, and ultimately this was rejected by the American Bishops' Council. But the laity liked it. The laity wanted to go back into a normal relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church. And so in 1945, Archbishop Alexis of Yaroslavl did arrive, and he demanded to convoke a council, to which Theophilus capitulated. But they also demanded that the American bishops sever any relationship with the synod in Yugoslavia and Metropolitan Anastasi. Now, Theophilus wrote to Anastasi and told him what was going on. And then he informed him that ROCOR was no longer needed in America. Anastasi replied that the Moscow Patriarchate was not free and would manipulate them, and this could only be saved, but this whole decision could only be resolved by a general council of the Church abroad, which was not possible at that time. Of course, this was immediately after World War II. There were 4 bishops who opposed this union of Moscow and the American Archdiocese. And these would remain steadfast throughout the next several years. Archbishops Tikhon and Vitaly, and Bishops Yosaf and Jerome. At this, there were 2 others also who did not go along with this. And they did not want to be in the American jurisdiction. And so they went over directly to the Patriarchate itself. And one of them, Makary, the other was Alexis. Makary became the exarch of the Moscow Patriarchate for North America. So in 1946, Metropolitan Theophilus was playing a double game. He had, on one hand, he had this whole negotiation going on with Moscow. On the other hand, he had a bishop consecrated who, as bishops have to do in the consecration ceremony, he swore his allegiance to Metropolitan Anastasia of ROCOR. Now, this whole thing was not sitting well. One of the bishops, and you have to remember this name, is Leonti Turkevich. He was a widower. He had been ordained a bishop, and he played a very prominent role in the life of the Russian diocese in America, and would later become metropolitan. Leonti also began having second thoughts, and he challenged the plan to sever relations with ROCOR due to the important role that they had in bringing about church order in America. And indeed, before the Metropolia returned to ROCOR, there was generally chaos. The next year, there was a bishops' council in Detroit, recognizing the necessity of cooperation with ROCOR, but having the autonomy of their own metropolitan district in mind. In other words, they wanted to be autonomous. They wanted to be autonomous, certainly from ROCOR, but they also didn't want to be subjected to Moscow completely, so they wanted to be autonomous. On the other hand, they also elected one of their bishops to become a representative, their representative on the synod in Yugoslavia. So basically, they were playing both sides. Now at the same time, there was a number of very prominent Parisian laymen who were lay churchmen who were on the, shall we say, more progressive side, who wrote letters and published them very strongly objecting to the continued relationship of the American church with ROCOR and urging them to simply submit to Moscow. Now in November of that same year, okay, they had the All-American Council in Cleveland. And the resolution was passed to go, some of this stuff, the sources that I was using jump around a bit. So the dates have to be, you have to rearrange the dates a little bit if you're making notes. At the All-American Council in Cleveland, there was a resolution that was passed to go under the Moscow Patriarchate as an autonomous church and to break with ROCOR. But if the Moscow Patriarchate did not accept, to be independent of both until such time as Moscow accepts them. Now, the vote on that at this All-American Council, this was the 7th council, and it was a crucial council. It was 187 in favor of that and 61 against. But of the bishops, there were 4 that were in favor and there were 4 that were against. So the synod was split down the middle. And then they gave, after that resolution, they gave over all the other decisions to be made by the Metropolitan Council. 4 of the bishops had walked out. 2 more left early, so there could be no meeting of the bishops to ratify the decisions of the synod, of the All-American Council. So they remained canonically invalid. However, Patriarch Alexei, when he was notified of this, decided to accept the idea of autonomy and was to send a metropolitan to negotiate that. Now, by this time, even the bishops that were in favor of this whole course of action began to feel remorseful. Metropolitan Leonti wrote to Anastasi of his remorse that pastors that he had trained had followed the masses to recognize the Moscow Patriarchate and break with ROCOR, and that the only way out was to preserve an autonomous existence both towards the Patriarch and the Synod. In other words, Leonti was writing that the bishops were acquiescing to the will of the laity and the lower clergy, rather than leading the church as bishops are supposed to do, and to stand up with what they believed. And they were afraid that rebellious parishes would pick up and take off and leave. To where, God only knows. But so by 1947, so 6 months later, those four bishops that I had mentioned, Vitaly, Tikhon, Jerome, and Yosef, were excluded from the Synod of the Metropolia with no canonical process. And Vitaly, Archbishop Vitaly, who was to play a major role in ROCOR, wrote that such an ordering of the of ecclesiastical life, in which the highest power is vested in church councils composed mainly of lower clergy and laymen, with bishops having only a single vote, is already completely non-orthodox. Hold on one second. Okay, sorry about that.
Could you repeat that last sentence?
Sure. Okay, it's a quote from Archbishop Vitaly. Such ordering of ecclesiastical life, in which the highest power is vested in church councils composed mainly of lower clergy and laymen, with bishops having only a single vote, is already completely non-orthodox. So, now remember, Vitaly was one of the members, had been one of the members of the Synod of the bishops of the United Church in America. They wrote a letter, and this was signed by the other bishops who dissented against, or who dissented with that resolution of the All-American Council. Let's see. So in May of that year, or July of that year, Metropolitan Gregory of Leningrad arrived, but he demanded loyalty oaths to the Soviet authorities of all of the clergy of the Metropolia. Of course, that did not go over. And so the union with Moscow failed. The Moscow and the Bishops' Council, what was left of it, put off the formation of canonical ties with Russia until it would be possible to do so with a free church. They decided they would commemorate the Patriarch, but only commemorate him, no administrative ties. And they would simply continue to live on their former basis as independent, both of, in full autonomy, both from ROCOR and from Moscow, as per the decision of the Seventh All-American Council. So are you following this, more or less? This makes sense? In other words, it was a mess. So one of the key issues dividing the church in America, and I would say that remains a major issue, that is not dividing the church at this point, but which is creating huge problems for the church and continues to, is the nature of, in the Metropolia and its successor, the OCA, is the authority of councils that are composed not of bishops, but of clergy and laymen, in which bishops are treated just basically like other clergy. Now, in current practice, in the OCA, the bishops do meet and they have to ratify the decisions of the All-American Council. But it's very important that at this Seventh All-American Council, in which they decided as a church to submit to Moscow and to break relations with ROCOR, which had been their context for many years already. That decision was never ratified by the bishops, and yet it became the operating canonical basis or uncanonical basis for how the OCA or how the Metropolia would proceed. So after the failure of the overtures to Moscow and Moscow's overtures to them, and this Bishops' Council of November 47 was signed by Metropolitan Theophilus, Archbishop Leonti, Bishop Ioan of Alaska, and the two new bishops, Nikon of Philadelphia and Ioan Shavskoy, both of whom were ordained right at this juncture, right at this time. And Archbishop John Shavskoy would become eventually the Bishop of San Francisco, and played a major role in the life of the Metropolia. But this issue of the nature of church councils is very important, and it's fundamentally an issue of ecclesiology. Now, if you remember that we had talked about how when St. Tikhon was bishop in America, he had been greatly exposed to the whole Episcopalian setup, in which councils like this actually governed the church. And so, for example, if you have paid attention to that, to the Episcopalians, they have their general conventions every so often. Now, in Orthodox councils, we never ever, at least in the past 1,000 years, for the most part, have taught, well, let's put it this way. We very seldom in the past 1,000 years have ever discussed doctrine. The Episcopalians, they have no problem changing doctrine, the major doctrines of the church, right and left. So there's a big difference here. Thank God for that. But when it comes to administrative matters and to the relationship and internal structuring of the church, that we do. In the 1917 council, there were actually some very prominent members who were strongly advocating for the development of these councils like the Anglicans had. And of course, some of those people, the more radical ones, ended up in the living church. But yet the 1917 council did create these councils which included both laymen and the lower clergy, in other words, priests and deacons, in the decision-making process. Probably no, and so in the Russian church, they do have these councils, but of course it's the Synod of Bishops that makes all the decisions. In ROCOR, we also have some, we have the, what are they? The All Russian Assemblies, or I forget what they're called exactly. Every several years, in which operate the same way. It's kind of like a big convention, or all diaspora councils. But they have nowhere near the kind of administrative authority that they do and that was implemented within the OCA. When the OCA was created, it significantly utilized the Council of 1917 to shape its statute. Plus, this idea of democracy was something very much embraced by all of these Russian immigrants, and especially the more liberal ones who had come through Paris. Now, one of the realities that had come up earlier, think back in 1922, that the bishops that came together to form the Synod of Bishops of the Russian Church abroad were mainly monarchists. Of course, what else would you expect for conservative people coming out of the Russian Empire and operating on that kind of level of imperial functioning and aristocracy? Of course, they would be monarchists. So, and to expect anything else out of them would have been strange. However, I'd already mentioned a few minutes ago that there was this whole group of progressive laymen in Paris, many of whom ended up coming to the United States and influencing the life of the OCA, the Metropolia, the OCA, through St Vladimir Seminary, which became the major ideological center for the American Metropolia and OCA. And so these people were anti-monarchists. They were social democrats, basically. And so you had a radically different ideology going on. Of course, there was always a mix of people and a spectrum of political opinion. But this political opinion very strongly influenced the life of the attitudes towards the church. So at this time, 1947, 1946, 1947, in America, you had the Russian Church was divided three ways. You had the Moscow Patriarchate directly. Then you had ROCOR on the other end of the spectrum. And then in the middle was the Metropolia. However, the Metropolia at this time was also declared double schismatic, both by Moscow as well as by ROCOR. By declaring them schismatic, that meant that the other churches did not recognize their sacraments. So this was a rather great predicament, because most of the churches in America, most of the Russian mission churches had landed in this in the Metropolia.
Pastor, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
About that? So can they, whether it's right or not for them to do that, if apostolic succession is still in place, wouldn't that be the main driving force behind that anyway?
Well, you see, apostolic succession is certainly is still in place. However, if you have, when a church breaks off and becomes schismatic, that status of schismatic actually negates the sacraments. So, for example, when Roman Catholics become Orthodox, we repeat the sacraments. And even from schismatic groups like this Ukrainian thing under the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the group in Montenegro, the schismatic church in Macedonia, their clergy are reordained. I don't think their people are rebaptized, but their clergy are reordained. Well, with the OCU, the Ukrainian, fake Ukrainian church, they're rebaptized. Or they're baptized into the Orthodox Church when they come in. They're because it was the sacraments were done by a schismatic body. So the church takes apostolic succession is not. This is an important thing. Apostolic succession is not as in the kind of Anglican, even Roman Catholic idea. It's not a historical game of tag, where one bishops, just lay their hands on the others and there they have apostolic succession. Apostolic succession is not just succession of ordination, it's certainly that. The charism of apostolic succession is the gift of the Holy Spirit, but it's something that occurs only within the body of the church. It's not, in other words, it's a succession of the church from generation to generation to generation. For example, you can't ordain a bishop without a specific community, without a specific see. He may be a missionary bishop, but he's still ordained for a specific community of people in a specific place, in a specific city. And this is an essential aspect of canon law. There's no such thing as bishops at large. And you have that phenomenon with what they call episcopi vagantes, vagrant bishops or bishops at large, who usually come out of the Anglican or the Old Catholic tradition, who have this idea that apostolic succession means that somebody just had their hands laid on them and it's like ecclesiastical tag.
Yeah.
That's meaningless.
Yeah.
It's meaningless. A bishop has to be elected by a synod of bishops to, as I said, a specific community in a specific place, and have a place in that synod. The in addition to that, that bishop has a seat on that synod of bishops. So all of the ordinations are orders. In other words, it's to a whole community of people that bear the same rank within the church. So there's an order of deacons, there's the order of priests, there's the order of bishops. And so when you are ordained, you are brought into this order of this community of men who share, and it is men, of men who share this same charism, the same task, the same rank, ultimately in the same organization. It can be different parts of the organization. In other words, different churches, different, in other words, Serbian church or the Russian church or the Greek church, it doesn't matter. So different parts of the organization, but it's still the same order. Does this make sense?
Yep. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
I had a question. This is Frank. Like, for example, the Oriental Orthodox, they're not in communion with the patriarchal sees that we're discussing here, but they are in communion with other patriarchates. And so there is a succession of faith. And so I don't know how they are viewed. I mean, they're not in communion with us, but they're not vague. They're not vagantes.
No, they're not vagantes. Now, one of the things I want to move into is talking about ecclesiology. And these are questions of ecclesiology. With the Oriental Orthodox or the Roman Catholics, both of them, there certainly is a schism between us and them. And there's a difference of opinion of how people from those communions are to be received. So, example, the Oriental Orthodox, if in most of the churches except for ROCOR, their clergy would be received simply by vesting. In other words, they would show up they would come to the liturgy, they would go to confession, and they would confess the Orthodox faith. In other words, they'd say the creed, and the bishop would put Orthodox vestments on them and serve with them. And so that also applies to Roman Catholics. Say with the Russian Orthodox Church, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and most of the churches. ROCOR is a kind of an outlier in its practice. The non-Chalcedonian churches, actually, speaking of the Russian church per se, the Russian Orthodox Church recognizes the orders of the Roman Catholic Church and of the non-Chalcedonian churches. Whereas it does not recognize the orders of the Anglicans or the Lutherans, for example. Not all Orthodox are on board with that. But that's the general, that, shall we say, that's the policy in the largest body of the Orthodox Church. There are different kinds of schisms. And we'll talk about, go through the canonical rules of schism, but then there's another aspect of schism, and that's what we're dealing with, both with the Latin Church as well as with the Oriental churches, and that's whole regional churches breaking communion over doctrinal issues, over disciplinary issues, or whatever. There's a distinction between that kind of a schism and the other kind of a schism, which is outlined in the canons of St. Basil. Now, in the canons of St. Basil, it talks about three types of bodies that are separated from the church, or three modes of separation. One is called a parasynagogue. In other words, an illegal assembly. It means that there was a clergyman, a bishop, or a priest who, for some reason or another, usually because of some sin, was defrocked by his legitimate synod. But he refuses to accept that discipline from the church. And in so doing, he continues to serve as a priest. Unfortunately, there's a lot of these people that are on the fringe of the church, and some of them were child molesters, some of them, all this kind of, these are the kind of reasons that people get defrocked. You have to be really bad to have done something really bad to get defrocked, right? And so, but they continue to serve. Now, if the next level is that of a schism, say that person is a bishop, and he decides that he's going to start a propaganda campaign against the church that he came from. Maybe he was wronged, or maybe whatever, but he starts not only pulling away people and parishes from the main church, but then he starts ordaining new bishops and priests. So this body is no longer just one parish where you have this clergyman who had been defrocked and continued to serve. Now you have a whole denomination, we'll call it, that is in schism, in a formal relationship of schism from the main church. Now there's a third category, and that's heresy. And that's a major doctrinal deviation that has been enacted by a council of bishops. So it's not just some individual dissenting from the church's teaching. It has to become an official policy of a schismatic church. So, for example, talk about schisms. There's this guy in Ukraine by the name of Philaret, and he had been the legitimate Metropolitan of Kiev. He was installed by the Moscow Patriarchate. He was a senior bishop of the Moscow Patriarchate, and he was legitimately defrocked for having completely violated not only his own monastic vows, because he got married and had 3 kids while being the Metropolitan. Can't do that. And he abused his clergy, which is a very severe canonical infraction. So he was legitimately defrocked, and but he continued to serve, and he mustered a group of followers, so that he created not just his own little show someplace, but he created a schism in the Ukrainian Church. And having done so, he proclaimed himself Patriarch of Kiev. Well, as a result, the Russian Orthodox Church, of which he had been a part, but from which he broke and created the schism, anathematized him. Now, to be excommunicated in the Orthodox Church, excommunication is basically a kind of a mid-level penalty. It means you're cut off from the chalice for X amount of time. Technically, a clergyman would normally not be excommunicated because there's a rule, a canonical rule, that says there's no double jeopardy. So you can be defrocked, but not excommunicated at the same time. Well, Philaret pushed it so far that the Russian Orthodox Church felt they not only had to defrock him, and because he had flagrantly violated that defrocking, so they decided to excommunicate him. Now, when we think of excommunication in the Catholic Church, that's what anathematization means in the Orthodox Church. It means absolutely cut off, essentially condemned to hell. You know, I mean, it's really, to be anathematized means to be accursed. And so Philaret, even though he was all dressed up as the Patriarch, you know, just in the same outfit as the Patriarch of Moscow, was basically an excommunicated layman playing church. That's how Orthodoxy looked, or how the main line of the Orthodox Church looks at this guy that Bartholomew rehabilitated. And not to mention that all of the churches in the world, including the Patriarch of Constantinople, completely supported Moscow's action to anathematize him. So that's a very contemporary issue that explains that. However, it's a big difference when you have an entire local church, an entire national church, go off into schism because they rejected this council or that council. I'm not so sure that I think it can be argued that a different set of criterion or different sets of criteria have to be employed to look at that situation canonically. So is there any questions?
Yeah. What happens to a layman in a church like that, where they don't have any other choice but to go along with their bishop's decision?
I'm sorry, it's good to see you.
Hi.
Long time. Well, so far as the Well, technically, if you go along with the bishop, then you're excommunicating yourself from the church, from the Orthodox Church. If you go along with the fake bishop, or if you go along with the schism. So if you're in Ukraine and you decide you want to go join the schismatics under Epiphany, you cut yourself off from the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, does that mean you have to be rebaptized? No, because you've already been baptized in the canonical church. But you'll have to go through repentance before you can return. You can't go back and forth from a canonical church to a non-canonical church and go to communion.
I'm asking more like, say like you're born in Ethiopia,
Yeah.
and you don't have access to a Russian Orthodox Church, nor do you even know about it. And the only church that you're really aware of or have access to is a Coptic church, or a Ethiopian church.
Then you go to that one.
So that's, but like for the layman, is that a question that they have to be bothered by, or is that just something above their heads that they don't really have to worry too much about at that point?
In that kind of situation, it's above their pay grade.
Okay.
Definitely. It's not like the Russian Orthodox Church is the only ark of salvation. And then unless you become Russian Orthodox, you're going to go to hell. That's not, nobody says that. But, and people, God, ultimately, we don't judge the other churches. We only judge, them when they come into relationship with us for a specific reason. So, for example, the whole schismatic thing is because the relationship is broken. How do you define the break in that relationship? That's what these categories of schism and heresy are.
Okay.
Now, for the most part, for example, and according to the ecumenical councils, laymen from the non-Chalcedonian churches would simply be received by confession.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a I'll scratch that. So ROCOR has its own thing. The Holy Mountain and ROCOR basically have the same kind of policy, but most of the church has a different approach to it. So, what else? Other questions?
I had a similar question. Suppose you were in suppose you're one of those, in one of those Ukrainian churches, everything was fine, and then one day you wake up and suddenly you're going to a schismatic church. I know it's above your pay grade, but there must be some, you must have some sort of obligation to kind of keep an eye on things and be active somehow in your church. And if you can't persuade via the church council or some other way of being active, then wouldn't you feel obliged to go to the church across town that was still Orthodox?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, in you know, it's one thing, say if you're born and raised in Ethiopia and that's the only kind of church that's there, go to that church. But if you're in Ukraine, where most towns have, you know, multiple churches, and some of them are in this with the schismatics, and some of them remain Orthodox, then as an Orthodox Christian, you must abandon the schismatics and go to an Orthodox church, and not have communion with the schismatics. So part of this is also setting the scene for our discussion of the whole Ukrainian mess, which is huge, quite frankly. It's the biggest thing to happen in to the Orthodox Church since the Council of Florence in 1438, you know. So anyway, can I go on?
I had to ask, I'm about to leave because I don't have much time today, but
Sure.
I was going to ask if you're having liturgy on Saturday.
Yes.
Okay, I'll see you. I'm getting emails about it, so I haven't known, but I'll see you there.
Okay. Are you still the same email address?
Yeah, I use a different one primarily now, but I still get emails at the other one too, but we can talk about that.
Okay. We'll send Marilyn an email and tell her you want to be updated at your new address.
Okay.
Okay, very good.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Hey, God bless you. Good to see you, even if it's kind of in the dark there.
Yeah, it's kind of, lighting's not very good in my apartment.
Okay. Very good.
I'll see you later. Thank you.
Adios. So, so I want to lay out basic principles of Orthodox ecclesiology. We talked about ordination, right? And how each of the orders, the bishops, the priests, and the deacons, which are the three orders of ministry, of the ordained ministry, of the one ordained ministry, incidentally. There's only one priesthood, which is shared three ways. And the bishop has the fullness of that priesthood. He shares most of it with the presbyters, and then other aspects of it with the deacons. And so when you have a bishop and a priest and a deacon serving together, there you have the fullness of the church present. The basic unit of the church is the diocese. And the diocese consists of the bishop with his presbyters, priests, presbyters, same thing, and deacons, and surrounded by the lower clergy and the laity. That's a local church. Within that, there are also parishes, but parishes are extensions of the bishop's ministry, and they enable the faithful to partake in the Eucharistic life of the diocese, of which the bishop is the main celebrant. That's why the bishop, who is called the hierarch or archpriest, archierei. Hierarch and archierei, it's just taking the two parts of the word and turning it around. Archierei means high priest. Hierarch means source of sanctification, or source of the priesthood. And so the bishop is the hierarch who is the source of the priesthood. This is what's also referred to as the monarchical episcopate, which doesn't have anything to do with the bishop thinking or acting like a king. It's all about the bishop being the single source, monarchos, single source of the priesthood and of sanctification. Because through the bishop, the grace of the Holy Spirit is given to the priests, and the priests, and to the deacons, and the priests baptize, they chrismate, they commune the people, they marry, bury, and so forth. But all the ministries flow from the bishop in the diocese. And this constitutes the basic unit of the church and is the local church. And it's specific to a particular locality. The basic ancient principle is that there is one bishop in each city. Now, a bishop has to be ordained by 3 other bishops. And first, he has to be elected by a synod of bishops, and he becomes a member of that synod of bishops. And he's given responsibility for that particular see. So you have the diocesan level, then you have a conciliar level. There are 2 aspects to a conciliary level, which I'll get to, or a synodal level. A bishop can only be elected and consecrated for a specific see. No bishops at large. Each synod of bishops is composed of the bishops of a particular area meeting around of the bishops who would meet together, and the bishop of the major city of that region becomes the senior bishop. He has seniority by reason of the ranking of the city. So for example, Washington is the capital, should have the Archbishop of Washington be the primate of the Synod for America. Now, there can also be local synods as well. So for example, in Russia now, there are 80 metropolitans. That means that those metropolitans have bishops under them. Bishops of small cities and bishops of monasteries. And they essentially form local synods, but those local synods are part of the greater patriarchate. They're part of the whole national church. The consecration of a bishop is a conciliar act. The election is conciliar, the consecration is conciliar, and the whole idea is to maintain the integrity of the body of the church. And to maintain the tradition of the church, and as it's handed over. In the ordination is literally a handing over of the tradition. The tradition being, the substance of the tradition being the grace of the Holy Spirit, the grace of the apostolic deposit, which is handed over in full from the bishops to the other bishops, and on and on and on and on. And then the bishops share that with the priests and the deacons. The most important difference between a priest and a bishop is that a priest cannot ordain. Only the bishops can ordain. So the geographical principle is essential in the organization of the life of the church. And this has been the organizing principle of the church since the very beginning. So in the very beginning, you had 4 or 5 major centers of the church, which coincided with the capitals of the major areas of the Roman Empire: Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople eventually was added to that, and Jerusalem was added simply because it's the mother church of all the churches. Now each region has a synod of bishops. That synod has a primate, in other words, a presiding, a president, who is the first hierarch, and can have a variety of titles. Can have a title of archbishop, can have a title of metropolitan, can also have a title of patriarch. It depends on the local tradition. The Greeks and the Russians use the titles differently. In the Greek church, an archbishop outranks a metropolitan. In the Russian church, a metropolitan outranks an archbishop. And archbishop is just a title of honor. In the Greek church, archbishop is the title of a major regional primacy. So the actual title of the Ecumenical Patriarchate is Archbishop of Constantinople, for example. The primate presides at the synod meetings, and he has a certain level of responsibility to be the point of accountability for the other bishops, to call the other bishops to account for how they're handling their offices. Within the church body, if you have several local synods, say several metropolias within a patriarchate, the patriarch is the primate, but you also have primates of each of the local synods. So, for example, we'll take in ROCOR, and we're an autonomous archdiocese within ROCOR, or within the Russian Orthodox Church. Metropolitan Hilarion is the first hierarch, he's the primate of ROCOR, but yet he also is on the synod of the Russian Orthodox Church. He's one of the 80 metropolitans of the Russian Orthodox Church, of which Patriarch Kirill is the primate. Now, the whole issue of what primacy is very much in discussion today. The primate in the Orthodox Church, primacy is mostly about presidency. It's about calling the meetings. It's about keeping the minutes. It's about, and I'll go into some of the duties, but it's not a position of authority over the other bishops. It's a position of authority within the synod of bishops, but not over. The metropolitan is not over the other bishops, or the patriarch is not over, but he bears that authority within. And actually, instead of looking at it as a pyramid, it's more like an inverse pyramid. And so the primate is the one at the very bottom who has to bear the weight of the whole thing on his shoulders. Just ask anyone who's been a primate, including the Pope. So the Pope is the primate of the Roman Church. And the Orthodox don't have any quarrel with that, by the way. There's an essential rule that comes down to us in the apostolic canons. that the primate does nothing without the consent of the other bishops, but the other bishops also do nothing without the consent of the primate. In other words, nobody does anything that affects the whole without the consent of everybody else. The primate can't go off on a power trip, but and the diocesan bishops need to tend their own dioceses and keep their nose to the grindstone and focus on their area of responsibility and not be messing in the affairs of any of the other bishops. Because another one of the basic rules of the episcopacy is that no bishop can interfere in the diocese of any other. And in fact, it's not just interfere. No bishop can enter, in other words, go across the border of the diocese of any other bishop, much less go into the churches of any of the churches of another bishop and celebrate the liturgy, much less do an ordination or anything else. That's something that's strictly forbidden within the context of the church. There's another aspect too, is that clergy have to, if they want to move from one diocese to another, from one bishop to another, they have to be released and accepted. It's not like a priest can just go looking around for a job that pays better and decide he's going to take a position in another diocese and just abandon his position and go and take the job from the parish council of the new church. We don't do that in the Orthodox Church. First, he has to get permission from his bishop to look for a new position. Then, if he finds something, then he asks the bishop of that other diocese to request his release from his original bishop. So there's a whole procedure, and the whole idea is to keep peace in the church, because bishops get very unhappy if you poach their clergy. So we try not to do that. And a priest cannot have canonical status as a priest if he hasn't gone through this and have the necessary releases, paperwork, whatever.
Vladika?
Yeah.
Basil here. How is that for just laymen moving around? Is there any special practice?
No, actually, laymen are completely free to move around. And in fact, technically, there are no releases given normally for lower clergy. For example, for readers and even subdeacons.
Thank you, Vladika.
Yeah, but it's a normal kind of thing for people to simply be able to go to other churches, and Orthodox do that a lot. In fact, in the urban churches in the old world, where Orthodoxy is the main church that's there, the parishes do not have a community aspect to them. They're churches within the community of the city or the village. And so there may be a little group of people in the church that gets to know each other because they work together, the priest and the deacons and the altar servers and the choir, they'll hang out and have coffee or something. But the laity just go to the church that they feel like, and they don't have a commitment to their parish. It's very different than in America. So, So we don't have, so over there they don't have this thing about parish membership. Membership means that you've been baptized. That's what it means. So the goal of these structures of the primacies of these various rules and things is to maintain the communion, to maintain communion, to make sure everybody's in communion with one another, and so that the communion is not disrupted. Now, the primate of a church, of a local church, of a whole national church, has certain specific responsibilities that are different than being the primate of a diocese, which is the bishop, or of a local synod within a greater patriarchate, for example. So the primate would preside at the meetings of the bishops, but he would also represent that synod to the other synods, to the other local churches. So the Patriarch of Moscow would represent the Russian Orthodox Church to the Patriarch of Serbia, to the Patriarch of Romania, to the Patriarch of Greece. And at this point, not represent the Russian Church to the Patriarch of Constantinople because they're fighting. Same thing with all the other patriarchates. The primate recruits new bishops. The primate is also oversees the formation of the clergy, and in particular, theological education, seminaries. His specific job is to maintain communion with the other churches. In other words, it's inter-church relations. And to maintain the relationships between the bishops within his own synod. The synod is the context of accountability for the bishops. And there's an aspect of accountability of the primate to his synod of bishops. But the primate is also accountable to the other primates of the churches. So one patriarch is accountable to the whole assembly of patriarchs. In other words, the primates are accountable on the level of an ecumenical council. Primates also judge cases between bishops, when there's a dispute between bishops within their own national church. Now, the only level above that is the Ecumenical Council. The Ecumenical Councils, actually an Ecumenical Council per se, only consists of bishops, and it consists of all the bishops of the Orthodox world, or as many as can show up. It's only recently has the Patriarchate of Constantinople begun to explore and the idea of an ecumenical council by representation. And that's because there's such a radical difference between the number of bishops and the size of the patriarchates. So there's something like 150 million people in the Russian Orthodox Church. It has 380 bishops. There's there's about 700 bishops. So there are more bishops in the Russian Orthodox Church than all the rest together. And there are more people and there are more parishes in the Russian Orthodox Church than everybody else together. the other patriarchates, some of them are huge. The Romanian Church, has 20 million. The Serbian Church has, 15 million. The Greek Church has 10 million. These are very large churches. Some of the other churches are very tiny. If you include the American and Australian and other foreign dioceses of the Patriarchate of Constantinople, it maybe has 2 million people, maybe. And within Constantinople itself, which is its actual jurisdiction, its jurisdiction is less than 10,000. And actually, for the people who actually go to church, it's a few hundred. At least Christmas and Easter. So you've got this radical disparity for all sorts of historical reasons between these all the various churches. And so on one hand, all of the primates are equal. None of them, while the Patriarch of Constantinople bears the primacy, he's still one vote on the synod. He's, and this is another aspect of the current problem with the Patriarchate of Constantinople. He's claiming much greater power than that, which distorts the whole Orthodox understanding of ecclesiology. What I'm teaching you is the basic traditional Orthodox understanding of ecclesiology, which is held by 99% of the Orthodox world. Let's see. The ecumenical councils are only called to deal with very acute problems and very specific issues. They don't call an ecumenical council just to get together and to talk about, what kind of vestments they like. Ecumenical councils only deal with very big issues and have never been used for anything else. So, and that's why we haven't had one for over 1,000 years. There have been various meetings, various synods, and various kinds of councils, but they're on a lower degree than an ecumenical council, where all the bishops of the entire world are present. Of course, it's kind of hard to do that when you have no emperor to foot the bill. Now, the Patriarch of Constantinople claims the title of Ecumenical Patriarch. This is an extremely controversial title. There was a big controversy over it in the 9th century, in which the Patriarch of Constantinople was sorely upbraided by the Pope for using such a title, which he thought was absolutely improper for any Christian bishop, because one could never be the bishop of the whole ecumeny. So even the Pope rejected that title. It's turned into something very problematic, to say the least. Let's see. The Ecumenical Patriarch is not a super bishop. He's just a bishop like any other who bears the responsibility to convene synods. He has the authority, like any other primate, to judge his own bishops, but he does not have the authority to to judge the bishops of any other patriarchate. If there's a primate that has gotten in trouble, it is his responsibility, which is supported by the whole church, to convene some kind of a tribunal to resolve that issue. So in a sense, he is the last court of appeal within the church. But it's only in very, very highly defined specific issues. So the way the church is structured, the most important level of the structure of the church comes from the nature of the ministries. You have the ministry of the bishop, you have the ministry of the presbyter, you have the ministry of the deacon, you have the ministry of the laity within the body of the church. The church is focused on its Eucharistic essence, and it's when the Eucharist is being celebrated that the church is at its fullest and is manifest in its fullness. And so that reality is then, you could say, projected into an institutional form. So you have a local church, you have the parishes, then you have the diocese, then you have the archdiocese and the patriarchate. You know, these levels of, which are all levels of conciliarity, levels of synods, each of which has a primate. The priest has the primacy in his parish. The bishop has the primacy. He's the first priest in the diocese. The bishop of the main city is the metropolitan of the local region. The patriarch has a number of metropolitans under his authority in his church. Nor a patriarchate is an autocephalous church by definition. There are two ranks of local churches, like in the sense of a national church. You have the church you have the local churches, like as on the parochial level, you know, or on the diocesan level. But what I'm referring to now is the national church level. And there are two levels. One is autonomy, and the other is autocephaly. Autonomy is a diocese, say ROCOR, for example. ROCOR is an autonomous archdiocese within the Russian Orthodox Church. There are a number of other autonomous archdioceses within the Russian Orthodox Church. For example, the Church of Japan is an autonomous archdiocese. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church is an autonomous archdiocese. All of these autonomous churches remain dependent on the mother church in some way or another. Now they range from something like the Ukrainian Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under Metropolitan Onufry, which would be the third largest Orthodox church in the world if it was independent. Because it's not as big as the Romanian church, but I think it's big, but it's bigger than the Greek church. It's bigger than the Bulgarian church. It's probably bigger than the Serbian church. So the Ukrainian Church, for example, as an autonomous church under Moscow, under the Russian Orthodox Church, the only real tie is that Moscow acts as a kind of a protector of the Ukrainian Church. And when the primate of the Ukrainian Church celebrates the liturgy, he commemorates the Patriarch of Moscow. That's called maximal autonomy. Now, normally, an autonomous church would not consecrate its own chrism. It would receive chrism from the mother church. Ukrainian church has the right to consecrate chrism, though I don't think they do. I'm not sure if they do. The Ukrainian church completely governs its own affairs. And in fact, it's so autonomous that they don't even have to have the approval of the mother church for the election of bishops, for the election of their primate, or for the canonization of a saint. The Ukrainian church can do that on its own. Church of Japan is a much lesser degree of autonomy. Its bishops have to be approved by the Russian Orthodox Church. It has to be accountable to the Russian Orthodox Church for its life, and it relies on the Russian Orthodox Church for its interrelationship with the other churches. Ukraine does too. Ukraine relies on the Russian Orthodox Church for its interrelationship with the Russian churches. In other words, there's no foreign minister, as it were, for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The Russian Church handles that. Now in ROCOR is an even less degree of autonomy. The bishops have to be approved by the synod in Moscow. We get chrism from Moscow, although they still haven't done that because they still have chrism from the past. And the bishops have to go and sit on the synod in Moscow in rotation. So it's a very important, it's a very strong relationship between the Russian church outside of Russia and the Mother Church of Russia. Yet there's a much greater degree of autonomy than, say, any of the internal dioceses of the Russian Orthodox Church. Say the Diocese of St. Petersburg, the Diocese of Volgograd, whatever. They each have their relationship, but because of the geographical distinction and national distinction, ROCOR is an autonomous church. So, for example, also the monastery of St. Catherine's in Sinai is an autonomous church. Even though they don't exactly reproduce their own members. They recruit them from Greece. But it's but here again, they have a tremendous degree of autonomy compared to other communities, other monasteries under the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Now, an autocephalous church is completely independent. Its accountability is to the whole church. Its accountability is specifically through the person of its primate to the synod of primates. So that the primate becomes responsible for assuring to the rest of the Orthodox primates that the church in his country is upholding the integrity of the Orthodox faith. Otherwise, no other bishops can interfere in the life of the local of an autocephalous church. They make their own chrism, they elect their own bishops, they canonize their own saints, they train their own clergy, they have their own monasteries. It has the fullness of life of the church. However, one of the main differences between an autonomous church and an autocephalous church is that very often you find an autonomous church in a country where which is where the whole population is not Orthodox, or where you have other Orthodox churches present. An autocephalous church usually means that all of the people in that of that country, or at least all of the Orthodox Christians in that country, belong to that one church. In the Orthodox Church, we have no concept of religious pluralism. And that's really critical to understand. We do not accept the concept of religious pluralism. The tradition of the church is that there's one country, should have one church, one hierarchy, and everybody belongs to it. It's a very, in other words, it's a completely integral vision of society as structured by the church. Now, obviously, we're a long way from the Roman Empire where that was the case. You still have that in some places. But this kind of integral vision is very important. And I think just to conclude this, the class for tonight, one of the issues, for example, with the autocephaly of the OCA is that it's one of 15 different jurisdictions. If it was truly an autocephalous church, then in other words, if it would fulfill its autocephaly, that means that all the other Orthodox Christians in North America would become part of that one church under that synod of bishops. Obviously, that hasn't happened. But this vision of a united autocephalous church has been at the heart of so much of the work that's been done and the hopes that were lived out in the history of Orthodoxy in America. Because what you can see as we've gone through this history, in 1924, there was the council where they declared temporary autonomy. 1934, they broke with the church abroad, and it essentially became, 1932 or something, whatever it was. They broke with the church abroad and became autonomous. And then 1946, they declared they declared autonomy, but essentially it was autocephaly. The reality, except nobody accepted it. You know, this has been a major theme in the history of Orthodoxy in America. And what we're going to see as we move on in this class is how that theme has played out over the past 50 years. So do we have any questions?
Yeah, Vladika, I have a specific question. You mentioned early on, you mentioned the name Turkevich. Father John Turkevich was a priest in OCA in Princeton. Are they related?
Well, it was Metropolitan Leonti, actually, who I know ended up, that John might have been his son.
That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah. Turkevich, there's also a Matushka Daria, now Carney, but Matushka Daria Turkevich Carney, or Carney in Michigan. So the Metropolitan Leonti had been a married priest, and his wife died, so he was widowed, and so you know, his kids grew up as very churchly people, whereas he went on to become the Metropolitan. So that's one of the big ecclesiastical clans within the church, and it seems like the priesthood, although we certainly don't emphasize the priesthood is something that's passed on from generation to generation. That certainly seems to be the reality within much of the Orthodox Church. So there are these huge priestly clans. Anybody named Papas or Papadopoulos or something like that in Greek comes from a priestly family. My own name, Paffhausen, it means I come from a priestly family, the Germans, but far enough back that they probably were Orthodox. And you have the same thing in the Russian Church, Popov, but you get the idea.
Thank you.
I have a question about autocephaly. Who grants autocephaly, or who is entitled to?
That's a huge question right now, because Constantinople is claiming only it has the right to grant autocephaly. Mm-hmm. That was not the case earlier on, and that's something we'll talk about at length. There was a protocol that was developed for this council, that was last council in Crete, that was not talked about, but where general consensus had been achieved among the churches, that autocephaly would be, the Patriarch of Constantinople would facilitate the process, but the autocephaly would be signed by all of the primates of all the churches. And it really, in other words, that they would thereby accept the autocephaly of that new local church.
So it was a conciliar approach.
It's a conciliar approach.
Without one man acting alone.
Right, exactly. So one of the key dynamics in church structure has been this fight between the conciliar and the papal model. And that's been going on for centuries and centuries and centuries. And so obviously the Roman Church went with the papal model. The Orthodox Church went with the conciliar model. So, and the non-Chalcedonian churches, and they have their own mixture of those two. We have a mixture, actually, of a papal model and a conciliar model, but much more strongly the conciliar model. That's being challenged right now by the Patriarch of Constantinople. So,
just to clarify, the OCA got its autocephaly from the Moscow Patriarch, right? Was that accepted?
Yes. No, it's not accepted by anybody,
Okay.
except for Moscow when it's convenient. For example, in ROCOR, we wouldn't be here if the OCA, if the autocephaly of the OCA was fully accepted by Moscow, because we're an archdiocese of the Russian Orthodox Church. We would be commemorating Metropolitan Tikhon at every liturgy if we accepted the autocephaly. However, when the autocephaly was granted, there was a part of the deal, if you want to use that language, was that ROCOR could continue to operate freely and without acknowledging any of the aspects of the OCA's deal with Moscow for its autocephaly. So
Complicated.
yeah, it is, and it's made my life very complicated, and it continues to be an interesting dance, shall we say?
Would you say that the United States is anomalous in that there are so many Orthodox jurisdictions here? That historically hasn't been the case, although I heard even 800 or 900 or 1,000 years ago, there were some other jurisdictions, small presence safe in Western Europe. You know, there was some, but pretty much there wasn't so many different jurisdictions all around in a given territory. That's, or am I mistaken?
Well, it's not just the United States. It's basically most of the other areas of the world that are not traditionally Orthodox have multiple overlapping jurisdictions. The so-called diaspora. I hate that word, by the way. It's not appropriate for Christians. We have one country, and that's the Kingdom of Heaven. We're not in diaspora. We may be in exile, but we're not in diaspora.
Okay.
The situation of Orthodoxy in the non-traditionally Orthodox lands is a huge problem. In fact, it's probably the biggest issue facing our church today, and how to deal with it appropriately.
Is it a more recent phenomenon, or it?
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, on the level,
it's only since 1923. So, now, Constantinople has gone in and it has divided several churches, several countries, and erected parallel jurisdictions in them, especially parts of the Russian Orthodox Church. In Estonia, recently in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, Ukraine, they've gone in, they've divided the church there in those places. So this is extremely problematic. So, okay, so it's 9:30. We kind of went long tonight. So, So we'll plan to meet next week, right? Okay. If you have any questions, email me. Okay. Very good. Well, let's pray. It is truly meet to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, without corruption. Thou gavest birth to God the Word. Through Theotokos we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever into ages of ages. Amen.